My name is Richard Medhurst. I'm happy to welcome a very special guest joining me on today's program, Professor Asad Abukhalil. Abukhalil grew up and studied political science in Beirut and later received his doctorate in the United States. He's taught at multiple US universities and was a freelance Middle East consultant for several American media outlets. He's currently Professor of Political Science at California State University, Stanislaus. Asad, thanks for taking the time. It's great to speak to you.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me.
Given that you're a professor, can you tell me about the atmosphere on college campuses in the United States regarding the Palestinian issue? On the one hand, I see people arguing that Zionism is failing, and on the other, we've got all these deans and faculty resigning. So just give me your perspective, if you would, kindly.
Richard, I've been in the United States since 1983. I first came here as a graduate student in Washington, D.C. And I can tell you without equivocation, I have never seen more energy, more passion for Palestine by college students in the United States ever. You will find in small college towns, affluent ones across the coast of California, for example, people chanting from the river to the sea. And sometimes they are joined by senior members of their community, progressives from different races, ethnicities, and so on. So definitely there's something going on. However, what you refer to as, the deans and the presidents all making all these statements that are very apologetic about Israel and its war and so on, branding all expression of support for Palestine as anti-Semitic, that's part of the backlash. I mean, It's very much like there's a book about the backlash against feminism by Susan Faludi, published in the 1980s, and she spoke about the success of feminism in America, liberal feminism, resulted in a major backlash against feminism and against women in America. We are witnessing something similar. The Zionist movement is freaking out, not only because of the manifestation of support for Palestine. I can tell you, ironically, that there is more concern and crackdown against Palestinian advocacy in America than before, but there is more bravery and fierceness in support for Palestine than ever. The phrasing that is used, the young people in America, especially Palestinians, but even others, are not afraid now of the intimidation tactics and the branding that is invoked by the Zionist lobby and its agents throughout the country, in the press and in the government and in Congress. So now they realize that while we should be very keen on expressing our support for Palestine in humanitarian terms, never succumbing to hate of any kind, they know that the Zionists invoke the term of anti-Semitic to brand any support for Palestine as anti-Semitic, when in reality it's not. There are people who support Israel who can be rightly branded as anti-Semitic, including President of the United States, from Truman to Biden, but those do not get the brand because they support Israel and shower it with money and military aid. So I think there's also among young Democrats, imagine, I never thought this. When I first came to America, young people or liberal Democrats were 10% supporting of Palestinians and 90% supporting of Israel. Today, among young Democrats, it's like half for Hamas and half for Israel, not even for Palestinian. They asked them, Hamas or Israel? They were not shy away from saying, we support Hamas against Israel. That, to me, is leading the Zionists to freak out.
In England, they're arresting people for saying they support Hamas. You can say you support Palestine, but if you say you support Hamas, which is, the key, the one that's actually manifesting their liberation, this is forbidden. You get arrested.
Well, here in the United States, there's a case when somebody in Chicago was arrested and sentenced to prison term for merely contributing money to a hospital in Gaza, which, according to the US government, is run by Hamas. The leaders of Hamas are, hospital directors and doctors and so on. That's the climate. It seems to me the Zionists are failing. The fact that they become desperate, the fact that they have become ridiculous in the most absurd ways of defining what anti-Semitism is an indication they are failing. The people are not buying their brand anymore. The Israeli brand today is the lowest has been since probably 1948 in terms of even Western society. What about the rest of the developing world? Africa and Asia is totally now with the Arab world in its public support and popular support for Palestine.
Let me ask you about the Zionist brand, because if we accept the Zionist brand as failing, what about the propaganda? Because, it is widespread, it is effective, and I'm sure you remember when the Iraq War began, I was a child and I still remember this weapons of mass destruction. I feel a lot of that Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism, it's still there, and they've exploited that to spread more propaganda. Would you agree with that?
I mean, it is still there, but whether it's succeeding or not is a different question altogether. You have to remember the context, Richard. In 2003 or 2001, with the war in Afghanistan, there were no social media to speak of. So as a result, the Zionists are able to control the mainstream media. They meet with the editorial people of the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. They meet with the publisher of these newspapers, and they take care of the coverage. The same thing with the New York Times today. They're doing a lousy job, the Washington Post, but young people are not reading the Washington Post or the New York Times. I mean, I ask my students, and you ask people on college campuses, they go rely on social media. This is why they want to ban TikTok, because it is containing, advocacy for Palestine. I mean, Zionists cannot keep on wanting more censorship in order to protect Israel from condemnation. I mean, how much more do you want to repress? Do you censor? I mean, look at the absurdity of the Meta company, for example. They keep on narrowing down the freedom of speech on these platforms in order to protect Israel from condemnation. But people are moving to other places. And this can't go on because people's consciousness are formed by images that cannot be erased.
Yeah. Yeah, truly. And I want to ask you regarding this myth that we keep seeing that Blinken and Biden, they're strongly telling off the Israelis behind the scenes, telling them to tone down the genocide, and yet they keep sending them weapons. Do you believe this is the green light for the invasion of Rafah, this latest shipment?
I mean, it's not a green light. The United States is a full direct partner in the genocide, as is Germany and the United Kingdom. They are full partners. They sent their own troops. They are helping in the murder and the slaughter of Palestinians. They make no qualms about it. They don't deny that. I mean, in the Pentagon, in the meeting with the Israeli Minister of Defense, they said they are presenting plan on how to continue with the slaughter. So as a result, we need to fault the United States not for its support, for its direct participation in the war.
Yes.
As for those leaks that you were talking about, those leaks about differences and that Biden was angry and he hasn't talked to Netanyahu for a week or something like that, they are intended to assuage Arab public opinion and to deceive Arabs and Muslims in the United States, especially because of the election tightness in Michigan and other places. Yeah, I don't put much value to these leaks at all.
What about people who are trying to portray Trump as being better than Biden? I think Trump himself said that were he president, there would have been no war right now in Gaza. I mean, I find this so laughable, but I wanted to get your opinion.
Well, I mean, my conscience is clear on this. I have lived in America since 1983. I have never voted in my life, not even for local elections, because I don't find any of the menu of choices desirable by me. Mm-hmm. And while I do not favor Trump over Biden or Biden over Trump, I certainly think I reject the Democratic Party claim that Trump is dangerous to Muslims because he wants to ban them. Well, I mean, if Trump plans to ban Muslims, Biden is killing Muslims. And I think Arabs in America have changed their mind entirely about the Democratic Party. They should have a long time ago, in my opinion, because neither party can be trusted, neither on domestic issue nor on foreign policy. Support for Biden among Arab Americans went down from 67 to 17%, and it will continue to slide because the genocide continues.
Israelis have been caught filming, well, not caught because it wasn't done in secret, but the Israelis have been posting their own war crimes, filming them,
bragging.
In widespread fashion. Every accusation is a confession. Do you agree?
I do. I mean, they are bragging. And the reason why they are bragging is because of this unconditional Western support. NATO is the West. The West is NATO, and NATO is a full partner in the genocide in Gaza. I mean, now we've seen, especially with the war in Ukraine, Finland, Sweden, all these supposedly nice countries are as aggressive, as militant, as racist as all other countries. And it's good that we have now the decline of the social democrat in Sweden and Norway, because now we see the West for what it is, what it has always been since the Second World War. It's a racist West, militaristic West, a West that is responsible for the genocide and occupation and aggression of the state of Israel in our midst, and also for the Western wars in our region, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya and other places.
I wasn't surprised, to be honest, with Austria, for example, voting voting against ceasefires. They're supposed to be a neutral country, and they draw a lot of prestige from that, from hosting the UN. But it of course fits the bill with how you just described it. I want to ask you, Professor. Right now it's Easter, and I want to ask you about Palestinian Christians, Arab Christians, because they contributed a lot to the resistance. They're not the only ones, of course, but people like George Habash. You wrote once that the last time you met him, he said, "We in the PLO tried and we failed. Now it's the turn of Hamas and Hezbollah, and they seem to be doing something different." I assume he meant it in a good way. Could you just elaborate on that, perhaps?
I mean, this is part of the ignorance of the West. I mean, they speak of Palestinians if they are all Muslims, and they speak about all Muslims if they're all fanatics. And those fanatics are all terrorists. That's how they are able to reduce Arabs to terrorism and Muslims to terrorism. Christians are part of the landscape. I mean, some of the early criticism and writing against Zionism were by Palestinian journalists who were Christians, Najib Nassar and Sakakini and many others. And what is also noteworthy is that these are the earliest Christians of the region, of the world, and yet they are totally dismissed by evangelical Christians, those who justify their support for Israel in terms of advocacy on behalf of Christians of the world and so on, who are supposedly repressed by Muslims and so on. And I think what you said is right. I mean, I personally was influenced by Palestinian Christians in my learning about the Palestinian problem. People like Fayez Sayed, people like George Habash. I mean, this man formed my views about Palestine since I was a boy. And yes, the reference to, you referred correctly to the last conversation I had with the late George Habash, in which he said, he was very modest about what he was saying. He said, we tried hard for many years in the PLO and Left and Fatah and others, and we failed. And now it's the turn of Hamas and Hezbollah, who are doing something entirely different. And he was very impressed with what they were doing. And he wrote a very laudatory letter to Hassan Nasrallah after 2006 war.
Wow. Can I ask you a more broader question? Although I know it's a loaded question. Why has Pan-Arabism failed?
Oh, wow. Pan-Arabism has failed for many reasons. One, Western countries and Israel conspired against any single attempt to unify the Arabs. They went against Jamal Abdel Nasser with a vengeance. They tried to kill him. They tried to bring him down because he was the symbol of Arab nationalism and Arab unity. And when he attempted one of the most original, inspiring experiences of uniting Egypt and Syria from 1958 to 1961, the Gulf countries and the United States and the West conspired against it to bring it down, and they succeeded. I mean, so that's one. And the second is the investment by Gulf countries. They control all media. They control all weapons of culture, the culture industry, so to speak. And they have been, since the death of Nasser in 1970, producing and stressing only elements of narrow nationalism within each nation states of Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and tribal and sectarian consciousness. So against the ideas of secular Arab nationalism, they brought their alternative of tribal, sectarian, and religious fanaticism, and also narrow type of nationalism against Arab nationalism. The third reason is the responsibility of the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party, which supposedly was the champion of Arab nationalism and unity, ruled in Syria and Iraq, and they set some of the most horrific examples. Here were two parties, supposedly the same party, the same ideology, and they were sending car bombs against each other's in the wars between them for many years. So I think the example of the Ba'ath did a set a terrible example. Fourthly, I think that the success of the Iranian Revolution and the rise of militant Islam from Saudi Arabia since the war of the Afghanistan in the 1980s undermined the ideas of secular Arab nationalism and brought alternative of religious ideologies and so on. So for all these reasons, we have to say that the collapse of the Soviet Union also did a tremendous damage to secular progressive ideas that were championed and supported by these countries. So now that a world is ruled by, the Western genocide axis, and the Middle East is run by the Saudi and United Arab Emirate regimes, tyrannical, totalitarian regime, that are aligning themselves with Israel and the West. And of course, the West has absolutely no problem with their human rights abuses because they serve Israeli agenda.
Can I ask you, Hamas' popularity has skyrocketed among Palestinians. Why do you think Hezbollah have been unable to overcome the sectarian groups in Lebanon?
That's a very good example. I mean, Lebanon is a very special case. Lebanon has always had half of the country aligned with Israel. Since 1948, the Israelis have been able to infiltrate Lebanon, to buy off politicians, to journalists, and so on. And I'm not surprised about that. There are also sectarian divisions within Lebanon, and those have been exploited by Israel from very early on. I just want to mention to you, there's a document from the 1920s in which Chaim Weizmann asked the Jewish Agency, which is a Zionist political organization, to formulate a plan to undermine the opposition to Zionism among the Arabs. And one of the 6 items of that plan that was presented to him said the instigation of sectarian divisions between Christians and Muslims. And Lebanon has been a fertile ground for that kind of Zionist exploitation. Hezbollah has also not handled the war against it. After 2006 and its victory and the humiliating defeat of Israel, has not handled it well because it was subjected to an unrelentless sectarian war and campaign by Saudi Arabia, UAE, on behalf of the Israeli-American alliance. And they were put on the defensive. And instead of trying to deflect that, to deal with it, to appeal to the large Arab world, they became often reduced to slogans that are sectarian in nature during the war in Syria, regardless of one's opinion about their intervention, their role in Lebanon, and so on. So they haven't succeeded in that regard as well. Hamas doesn't have that sectarian problem. It's a Sunni Muslim organization and so on. Even the enemies of Hamas over the years, like Fatah and Gulf countries, have also accused Hamas, even though it's Sunni, of being Shiite and Iranian in its orientation, which doesn't make any sense. But what you said is true. The popularity of Hamas has skyrocketed. People are chanting for Hamas in many Arab capitals. And despite expectation by Biden and by Israel that the popularity of Hamas would be gone because of this war, it has actually made the movement more popular than ever. And there is no chance, no matter what they do in Gaza, that Hamas will be eliminated. Hamas today is where Fatah and the PLO was in 1968 after the Battle of Karama. And the military performance of Hamas and Hezbollah is way beyond the performance of the PLO, which was highly exaggerated during the Battle of Karama in 1968.
You say Hezbollah's performance is, it far exceeds previous gains made by the resistance. How has people's opinion of Hezbollah changed inside of Lebanon?
Well, it depends. I mean, according to public opinion surveys, during this war, support for Hezbollah among Sunnis has increased. Among Christians, it has not increased. So there are sectarian divisions. Among the Shiite population, I mean, there's no question the choice of the resistance option is widely popular. And Hezbollah and its ally Amal, which has also participated in the resistance in South Lebanon, even though it has not been mentioned by the media in the West, has succeeded in gaining 100% of all seats reserved for Shiites in the Lebanese parliament. Hezbollah has a Lebanon problem, and they're aware of it. And I think it has tied its hand. And the West and Israel have tremendous influence. I mean, they say that Iran, controls Lebanon. In reality, it's the United States that imposes cruel hegemony in Lebanon. They control the army, the security services, the central bank. They control the banks of Lebanon. They control most political parties, civic societies, the media. All that is under the U.S. control, and they say that it's Iran that controls Lebanon. So there is a problem. There are millions of dollars invested in order to undermine support for the resistance. So Hezbollah has been on the defensive. But as far as the effectiveness of Hezbollah's military performance against Israel, nobody can question that. Even the enemy knows that. Israel has never been scared of a foe more than it has been scared of Hezbollah. The only reason, after several months of fighting in South Lebanon, they still do not dare to invade Lebanon like they used to. I mean, they used to invade Lebanon anytime they wish. Now they know there is a very high price to pay. Hezbollah is also aware of that, and they keep on improving and maintaining their abilities. And the best example I want to tell you, Richard, which always struck me, during the PLO days, where I was a boy and I was aware of what they do and what they're doing, they didn't have Hebrew speakers in Palestinian political organizations. I mean, these military organizations supposedly, trained and organized to fight Israel, they didn't have Hebrew speakers. They always used to borrow the Hebrew speakers of the Institute of Palestine Studies. Hezbollah formed its own Hebrew teaching school. Their military cadres in South Lebanon went through Hebrew training. They intercept communication by Israel. I mean, Richard, it's a different scale of resistance. And this is why Israel and its allies in the world are freaking out. They have every reason. They are facing a foe they have never seen before. Their military imagination is nothing like the comedic, clownish, buffoonish performance of Yasser Arafat and his cronies.
I completely agree. And Asad, I want to ask you, because you mentioned the American influence in Lebanon. You got me thinking yesterday of your tweets about UNIFIL. You know, my parents both served in UNIFIL, and the only people that would strike them are the Israelis. So they taught me since I was a boy, the UN doesn't work, and it doesn't work because of the Americans, because of the Israelis constantly undermining every mission, whether it's in UNDOF, between Syria and Israel, or in the Jerusalem Bureau. They just sabotage them completely. And these tweets that an explosion occurred, I mean, it's really comical. They speak like this about, like an Israeli wrote it.
Your parents were not responsible for this when I say it, but UNIFIL was set up by America in defense of Israel, and since 1978. That was the purpose. They wanted to spy on the people of South Lebanon. They want to undermine the resistance. That was the mission from the beginning against the PLO, and now it's against Hezbollah. And they do not even dare to mention Israel when they are attacked by Israel. I mean, that tells you
incredible.
The level of complicity and collusion with the state of Israel. Richard, there's an American U.S. Army colonel. His name is Augustus Richard Norton. He later became a well-known scholar of the Middle East. He taught at U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And I got to know him over the years. He died a few years ago. And he wrote on people of South Lebanon. He served in UNIFIL at first. And he was turned against Israel by virtue of his service in UNIFIL because he saw the crime of Israel. He wrote a book on the Amal movement. He later wrote a book on Hezbollah, by the way, which I recommend to the audience.
Okay, I will certainly check it out. And, this is, again, the opinion of many people who go and serve in these UN missions. They see what Israel really is.
Exactly.
If I can ask you, Asad, about Egypt. Well, first of all, Jordan, but it's related to Egypt. Yesterday, there are these protests, and they've been taking place all week, actually, in front of the Israeli embassy. What do you think? Are you satisfied with the scale of the protests? Why the sudden surge? And do you think that, just as we're seeing an unprecedented resistance, that we might see unprecedented changes? Can the people force the security services and the king to actually do what they want?
Well, I mean, the people of Jordan have always been supportive of the Palestinians. This hasn't changed or diminished over the decades at all. And same for the people of Egypt and Morocco. There have been demonstrations throughout the Arab world. The biggest, most massive demonstration for Palestine took place inside Yemen, the country that is suffering from one of the worst humanitarian crises by virtue of the Gulf and Western war on the people of Yemen. And Yemen has tried, even in military terms, to extend support for the Palestinians. In Jordan, the people there are very upset about what's happening inside Palestine. The stories about, footage of the genocide are shown on TV screen, and they have been making their views public. And what is happening, I noticed in Jordan over the last few days, Richard, the Saudi media have been playing a very sinister role, trying to agitate, just like they do in Lebanon in sectarian terms. They are trying to sow hatred between Jordanians and Palestinians, and they are making claims that the protests are inspired by Iran and by Hamas. So I would say the noise we hear in the last few days, really, this is part of the work of the Saudi and UAE government that are really doing tremendous work in their media in support of the Israeli genocide in Gaza.
It's scandalous, honestly. Asad, regarding the Egyptians, Sisi's been given $7.4 billion euros by the EU. He received another 8 billion from the IMF, 32 billion from the UAE. If you recall, they offered Sisi all this money before to take the Palestinians and put them in the desert. To me, this confirms a thesis that I presented in three parts, that they're trying to ethnically cleanse Gaza. They want to make it into a port, to dig a canal, take the gas, send it to Europe. I just want to ask what your opinion is about all this giant amount of cash flowing to Egypt suddenly. Would you agree that they're headed in this direction?
No, we are supposed to believe that IMF and the World Bank only extend loans and grants on the basis of need, not on any political consideration. That's in theory, of course, but now we know otherwise. In the case of Russia in the 1990s, IMF suddenly came up with money in order to boost the chances of Yeltsin to win the election over there. So, I mean, these are political arm of Western imperialism, has always been the case. That hasn't changed. Egypt is like a case. Since 1970, with the death of Nasser, the West has extended billions of dollars to any government that makes peace with Israel. If you make peace with Israel, you will be awarded an annual subsidy. That's the case in Jordan. That's the case of Egypt. They tried to do that in Lebanon in 1983, but of course there was a popular revolt which would not allow peace treaty to go forward in Lebanon. They tried to do that in the Sudan before this brutal war that's happening, which is tied to Israeli interests and UAE interests as well. So they do that, and yet it doesn't end poverty. I mean, here is Jordan many years after the peace treaty, and there's still economic hardships. Egypt has had a peace treaty with Israel since 1978. The economic hardships are worse than ever. But yeah, they keep on, bribing rulers if they serve Israeli agenda, and that's why Sisi is being rewarded for his role in Gaza.
Regarding Yemen, their blockade is truly unprecedented, and it's been wildly successful. I want to ask you your thoughts on what the Houthis have accomplished in this recent campaign. 86 ships, I believe, is the number. 86 ships that they've struck. What do you make of their efforts?
The Arab world is very impressed, Richard, very impressed. As you probably know, Gulf media have branded the Ansarullah. They call themselves Ansarullah. They are known by their critics as Houthis. And they have been branded as Iranian agents and as tools of Iran, that they don't represent the Yemenis. And of course, that has been proven to be totally false. Even WikiLeaks in US internal documents, they concede that the Ansarullah, when they came to power, they were not at all even close to Iran. They became close to Iran in response to the brutal war against them that were launched by the Saudis and the West and so on. Now, the Arab world has gotten to see how much intensity in the support for Palestine there is among the people of Yemen. And I think it has made Ansarullah more popular than ever, despite the brutal siege against Yemen and the strangulation of Yemen by the Saudis and their Western allies. But Arab world took notice. They really now regard Yemen as the best example of how to show support for the Palestinians. There are massive demonstrations. We're talking about hundreds of thousands every single week, Richard. Every single week. You see the footage, I'm sure. So there is public support, and there's also military intervention to try to block shipping into the illegal state of Israel.
Yeah, those protests, they make London look like a joke. It's incomparable.
No Arab country has seen more, massive protests like those of Yemen by far.
Why not? I also want to ask that question. Why not?
Many reasons. One, unfortunately, the rise of social media has falsely led people to believe that protestation on social media amounts to the same effect of protestation on the street. And that cannot be compared at all. Protestation in the street is what gets Western people's attention. Protestation in front of Western embassies is what can cause policies to be changed, not social media. The second reason, the dosage of repression has increased over time with Western support. So there is a lot of, look at the Palestine case in West Bank. I mean, the West Bank, there is a 90,000 strong army of repression that is trained by the CIA, and the only purpose they do, they don't protect West Bank from Israel, of course, they protect the West Bank from resistance, from the Palestinian people, from even civil and peaceful protest.
Yeah.
So there are these armies. The third is there is an element of hopelessness in the Arab world. Many believe that no matter what we do, there is a tremendous constellation of forces of the Western Genocide Alliance against us, and that's very little we can do. So for all those reasons, and also divisions, you have to remember that Gulf governments invested so much in dividing the Arabs, dividing Kurds against Arabs, dividing Amazighs against Arabs in North Africa, Christians and Muslim, North Sudan and South Sudan. That's the work of years and billions of propaganda, Gulf and West.
You mentioned the security services in the PA. I remember when they beat Nizar Banat to death. I mean, that's a scandal that is just one scandal that hasn't left my mind.
Right.
I mean, what is the solution for the Arabs to overcome all these obstacles that have been placed in front of them?
Total dismantlement of the PA. We should not settle anything like that. I have been calling, and I've received a lot of attacks. The Fatah movement and the PLO issued a statement against me a week ago because I have been saying we should reconsider. The Palestinian people need to reconsider the terrible, horrible legacy of Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat got us to this point. He is the one who established the false notion of liberation under occupation. He is the one who made the ridiculous, absurd declaration of independence while the country is under occupation. He is the one who set up the Palestinian Authority and started the campaign, the brutal campaign against Hamas and others who were engaged in resistance. He is the one who set up the most corrupt organization in the history of the region, in the PLO and later in the Palestinian Authority. He is the one who picked Mahmoud Abbas, a man without any popular base, to make him a successor. He is the one who picked people like Mohammed Dahlan and all these characters. He is the one who trusted the United States and the West. I mean, it is true in his last few years, he realized how wrong he was, and he started to return surreptitiously to the course of armed struggle, and that's why they killed him. But the point is we need to reconsider that, and we need to treat the Palestinian Authority as an appendage of the Israeli occupation, just like the South Lebanon Army during the year of Israeli occupation of South Lebanon. I mean, we cannot, and this is my criticism against the Palestinian left like the PFLP, you cannot treat Mahmoud Abbas as the esteemed president of Palestine. No, he is a brutal, corrupt tool of the Israeli occupation. He is a traitor to his people. We should say that. And we should work, the Palestinian, before demonstrating against Israel in the West Bank, they should demonstrate against Israel. They should equally demonstrate and protest against the Palestinian collaborationist regime of Mahmoud Abbas.
I remember when Yasser Arafat, the tanks were surrounding his house. I remember that on television. And, I believe they killed him after with his medicine or something like that. But
correct.
The protesting against these regimes or institutions and assets of the West, how do we go about that with the Gulf? Because these states possess a lot more resources. The UAE, the Saudis. How do we dismantle these regimes?
I mean,
I know I'm asking you a loaded question, but
no,
we have to start discussing it.
I mean, the chief political aide to Abdel Nasser, Sami Sharaf, the late Sami Sharaf, he told me that he was assigned by Nasser during the years of the 1960s to make a plan for the overthrow of the Gulf regime, and it didn't succeed. They are supported by the West, just like they support Israel. I mean, for the same purpose. And because the Gulf regimes are a great support for Israel ever since 1948. They have never posed a danger. I mean, they funded the PLO in order to fund the buffoonish, clownish version of Fatah organization and Yasser Arafat against the radical leftists like George Habash and Wadi Haddad and the others. The Gulf regime now have a very sophisticated, extensive intelligence services that are set up by Western intelligence services. UAE is the most advanced surveillance state in the world, and they rely on American and Israeli technology. UAE is a regime like no others. People speak about East Germany, but they don't speak about UAE today. I mean, I know one professor in the UAE who once was arrested over a tweet, and when he was released, he went home he discovered that there is a device that was placed in his living room. He can't dare touch it. It was placed in his living room. He certainly has not been the same ever since. That's the UAE, and that's Saudi Arabia. And yet we hear now all applaud and favorable coverage of Saudi government because they just announced that there is going to be a Miss Saudi Arabia in the next Miss World pageant.
Yes, I saw that. Yeah. Well, I guess that absolves them of everything.
Absolutely. And they allow dancing and wrestling. What else can you hope for in Saudi Arabia other than that, right?
Well, it's the emancipation of women, according to the West.
Right. Represented by beauty pageant.
Right. How come they haven't been able to defeat Hamas or degrade Hamas infrastructure? We're going off of 6 months now, and Hamas, they're still going strong. How is that possible?
Richard, I don't want to be poetic, or using flowery language, but there is no question. The Palestinians have been resisting for over a century. They just cannot be defeated no matter how much you go against them. I would say the same thing about the people of South Lebanon, from which I hail. Since 1948, South Lebanon has been cut off from the rest of Lebanon by virtue of the collaboration of the central government and the presidents of Lebanon, successive presidents of Lebanon, to the Israeli government. And it has been totally left subject to Israeli brutal war, raids and invasions and so on.
Yes.
And the people of South Lebanon today are more determined on resistance than ever. No matter how much billions are spent to lure this Shiite and that Shiite from South Lebanon to support non-violent, pot-banging method of struggle, it hasn't worked. And the same thing for the Palestinians. They just can't surrender. They won't surrender, no matter what you do. And whenever you defeat one organization, new ones come out, and they are better than before, more effective than before in terms of military effectiveness.
Do you see a role for China, for Russia in this new age that we're entering, this multipolar world? Because the deal they just made with Yemen, for example, where they will provide political support in the UN Security Council in exchange for keeping their ship safe. I mean, we know that they're going to keep their ship safe anyway, but it was sort of a way to make things official. How do you see China and Russia's role in the Middle East?
I have been very unimpressed with their roles in the Middle East. They continue to have very strong relations with Israel. Mm-hmm. China cannot make pronouncement in support of the Palestinians while at the same time caring so much about the relationship with Israel. You see, China and Russia operate with Israel very much like Arab rulers. They think the way to the heart of Washington is through Israel. I mean, it is not an absurd calculation, but you have to decide where is your ideology and where are your interests and where is your long-term interest. Your short-term interest, economic and otherwise, may be through Israel because you want approval of the United States. But it doesn't work. U.S. is intended on being hostile to China, no matter how much China tries to appease Israel and America. And in recent months, I have been totally unimpressed with China and Russia. Russia has sat down while Israel has been attacking Syria successively. Clearly, Putin has given the green light for Israel to attack Syria as many times as it wants. There has been hundreds of attacks without any response from the so-called missile that they place and so on. So they are collaborators with Israel in aggression against Syria and against Hezbollah, for sure.
I asked a Syrian official once why the Russians just allow the Israelis to keep bombing Damascus every 2 weeks, and he said that obviously they can't open up another front because they're busy fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. This is a few years ago now. What do you make of that response?
Well, I mean, there's no ISIS left anymore, really. I mean, I don't want Russia to use the pretext of ISIS like the way America does to occupy countries. I mean, America uses the pretext of Qaeda and ISIS in Syria and Iraq to continue their occupation of those countries, and in Libya, of course. They have strong military presence in Libya as well. But I think that Russia and China will have to decide. Do you want the friendship of the Arab people or you don't? You cannot continue this double policy of continued support and relationship with Israel while claiming to care for the Palestinians. What has either country done in order to stop the genocide? Why didn't they champion the South African plan in the International Court of Justice? They didn't dare.
Right.
They were afraid of the United States. They are still afraid of the United States. America has declared America is directly involved in a war against Russia, but Russia is still afraid of the United States. The United States is provoking China, and China continues to be afraid of the United States.
I'm afraid I have no choice but to agree with you, honestly. It's infuriating. It's really infuriating because, for example, the ICJ case that you mentioned requires no military resources. I mean, Ireland, for example, have done more. And the Russians, the Chinese have benefited Syria at the UN Security Council, but, you know, we are not talking about that. We're talking about something else.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you, Asad, how do you see Syria's future? Because Syria has been carved up. It has a million holes in it, like Swiss cheese now. It's occupied by the US, as you mentioned. They're dealing with Israeli strikes. There's ISIS. How do you see Syria going forward?
I mean, Richard, you asked me earlier about Arab nationalism and Arab unity and what happened to Arab nationalist ideology. Look what they've done in Iraq. Iraq was the center of Arab nationalism. The United States invaded the country, destroyed it, and splitted it along sectarian ethnic lines. How can you patch it back together? Yeah. I mean, in Iraq, there were no notions of Sunnis and Shiites. I remember Iraq used to come to Lebanon and they said, we are so different than you are with those sectarian differences. It wasn't like that. America made it like that. Look what they've done in Syria. I mean, the destruction of Libya, of Somalia, of Sudan, of Iraq, of Afghanistan. This is the work of the Western imperialist project of NATO. And Syria, they are openly saying, we don't want it to have peace. We don't want the people to return. Forget about the regime. They say, we don't want you to rebuild your house. The United States and the West are preventing individual humans in Syria from rebuilding their homes.
Yes.
Because subject to the so-called Caesar sanction. I mean, it's the Western plan of our region to fragment it, to divide it, because they want to surround Israel with destroyed societies. They did the same with Lebanon. All the people in charge of the financial sector in Lebanon were tools of the United States. 90% of the politicians in Lebanon responsible are tools of the United States.
For me, you say it's the work of the imperialist, the Western imperialist project. I mean, I thought you were going to finish the sentence with "it's the work of the devil." I would have still agreed with you. It's really heartbreaking. I haven't gone back to Syria actually since the war began, and sometimes I guess there's nothing to go back to because of what they've done. So, it's very tough. It's very tough. Asad, any final notes, any final thoughts you'd like to close with? The floor is yours.
Well, I mean, I think that there's no question support for Palestine is sweeping the world, and not only on Western college campuses. I see support in developing countries as well in the so-called Western countries, North and South. And I think this should give us more impetus to continue expressing support for the Palestinians, and not to be intimidated by Zionists. And I'm very encouraged by that. I feel it among Arab Americans today. When I first came to this country, it always bothered me how easily intimidated Arab American speakers were and writers by Zionist intimidation tactics. Now it's not like that before. And that should encourage us to not compromise in our slogans, not compromise in our goals and aims for the establishment of a free Palestine where people can live freely regardless of religion, Jewish, Christians, or Muslims. And to return all Palestinian refugees to their homes, all of them, not symbolic return, full return, and to punish all those collaborators in the Palestinian Authority and others, because they have committed crimes, war crimes against their people.
Amen. I couldn't agree more, and I'll just end by saying, long live the resistance, tahya al-muqawmeh, power to the Palestinians. That's it. Thank you very much, Asad. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. I'm so grateful we got a chance to finally sit down and talk. Thank you very much. Take care. Cheers. Bye-bye. Again, YouTube demonetized my channel because I'm not allowed to say naughty things about Israel. Telling the truth is forbidden. So if you are able to donate a few dollars on PayPal or on a monthly basis on Patreon, please consider doing it because it would really help me continue my journalism and support independent media. So I'd be very grateful. And the links are in the description and also in the chat. Thank you guys very much again for all your donations and all your kind comments. I appreciate it very much.